I'm going to be very, very blunt. I do not like Tom Barrack. I think he's a dangerous man. He is the U.S. ambassador to Turkey, or Turkiye, as he likes to say. And he's also Trump's special envoy for dealing with like Lebanon and Syria and that whole Turkish area of influence. And in my opinion, his advice, or if that's the advice that the Americans are taking, the handling of Syria is one of the greatest foreign policy disasters in the current Trump administration, which has many foreign policy successes, but the handling of Syria has been a disaster, and a lot of that has to do with this unhealthy relationship that the United States has with Turkey, which is exemplified by Tom Barrack. Now, all that being said, the reason I bring this up is that he spoke yesterday, or a couple days ago, at the Antalya conference. What is this thing called? It's the Antalya like foreign policy conference or something that's being held in Turkey. It's an event being put on by the foreign ministry of Turkey. And he gave a little talk, and then he took some questions. The whole thing is about half an hour long, and it is filled with appalling statements by Tom Barrack. I could actually make a series of videos about this, but what I want to do here is just play you the first 3 minutes of his remarks, and then I'll share my thoughts on what he had to say there. So here we go. Here's Tom Barrack.
Lebanon, 1949, they had an armistice agreement. It didn't work. Then 15 years of civil war. Then 1979, the Taif agreement. Taif agreement, by the way, if you go back and look, is exactly what we're talking about now in the ceasefire or peace agreement. The Taif agreement didn't work. It was a realignment of the confessional system and a ceasefire, except for Hezbollah. Hezbollah, by the way, I always get in trouble because Hezbollah, in American parlance and most of the West, is a foreign terrorist organization. Hezbollah in Lebanon is also a political organization. The Shias have 27 seats in the parliament. So it's the opposite of what there was in Ireland, of saying we have a military organization that needs political efficacy. It has political efficacy. Then that didn't work. So today, in effect, in Lebanon, there's a November 2024 cessation of hostilities agreement, which exactly is the same thing we're trying to do now. It's a ceasefire south of Litani, disarm Hezbollah. How are you going to disarm Hezbollah? If you did a census, there hasn't been a census in Lebanon since 1938. If you take the Shias, the Palestinian refugees, the Syrian refugees, it's probably the majority of the people in Lebanon. And the Lebanese Sunnis, which is the majority of the Lebanese armed forces, are not going to go shoot their cousins, especially at a time where Israel is bombarding them, which only gives efficacy to the reason Hezbollah should exist, to protect itself from Israel. So what's the answer? The answer has got to be underlying prosperity. When you have a sovereign nation like Iran, which is supporting a militia, you cannot get rid of that militia by killing them. It's the same philosophy in each country. You need to start with prosperity, from the individual to the family to the tribe to the community. And this is why my humble opinion, and I think my boss's opinion, is left to the region. The Abraham Accords eventually is the answer, and Syria is an experiment alongside of Turkey, who is allowing them to do it. Turkey, which happens to be the only real economy in the middle of this very complicated region. It's a real nation. People, resources, army. We talk about NATO being the second largest supporter of NATO. It is, but it's also one of our most relevant and important engines now when we go to this just-in-case philosophy of saying, well, law of the seas didn't work very well, or the Straits of Hormuz. We also have the Straits of Dardanelles. So the alliance of saying, how do you marry these convergent points of view? It has to be prosperity. It has to be alignment of interests where the individual is going to be better. And giving up points of view in religion, let everybody have their own religion. Let them have their point of view. It's just not happening.
Okay. Oh, yeah. Got to tell you, it's infuriating to watch this guy. Look, Tom Barrack's a smart man, okay? And he knows Lebanon. And some of what he just said has to be taken seriously because of the position he holds. But there's so much in this clip that needs correcting, both at the factual level and at a deeper level, that I want to walk through it carefully. Okay, let's start with the Taif agreement. He started with that because he invokes it as his central historical reference point right at the beginning. And he gets everything, almost everything about it wrong. First of all, the date. He says 1979, the Taif agreement. The Taif agreement was signed in 1989, and that's not a minor slip. 10 years is a decade of Lebanese civil war. He also, his whole timeline at the beginning was off. Talk about 1943 and then 15 years of civil war. The Lebanese civil war started in 1975 and went until 1990. Okay, the Taif agreement was signed at the end of that in 1989. In fact, you know what? This is a good point for me to make my plug. I often do it later. I do it at different times in the video. But let me make a plug here for the Israel 365 News YouTube channel, because the reason I'm doing this right now is because of one particular video I want to point out to you. Okay, so first of all, you got to be subscribed to this channel. Very important. A lot of important content I put up here. It's not the same as what goes on this channel. And if you go down it was 3 weeks ago, there's a video titled "Something Crazy is Happening in Lebanon Right Now." Go find that video. What that video actually is it's an explainer video. It's 15 minutes long and will explain to you what the Lebanese political system is. And it's actually, that might sound boring. It's not. It's a very interesting story, and it goes back to the founding of Lebanon and explains the whole makeup of Lebanon and its political system so that you can understand what's actually happening. When you hear about the Lebanese government and President Joseph Aoun and the prime minister and the speaker of the house and the Shiites and the Sunnis and the Christians, you want to understand Lebanon, watch this video. And then you can watch Tom Barrack again, and you yourself will realize how off he is. But I digress. Let me get back to what I'm saying about his comments here. Okay. So again, the Taif agreement was signed in 1989. Okay, and getting that wrong undermines the entire argument he's trying to make. But the date is, again, getting the date wrong is the least of the problems with what he says about the Taif agreement. He literally said the Taif agreement is, quote, exactly what we're talking about now in the ceasefire or peace agreement. Now, this comparison doesn't hold up under even the most minimal scrutiny. I'd argue it reveals that he doesn't really understand what the Taif agreement was at all. The Taif agreement was not a ceasefire. It was a comprehensive political restructuring of the Lebanese state. It redistributed power between Lebanon's different religious communities, what they call the confessional communities. And he did mention that. He said, it was a reordering the confessional. Yes, it was. But that's what the Taif agreement was. It was an internal Lebanese restructuring of their political system. Watch the video that I just mentioned. It'll explain more. But here's the key point. In the Taif agreement, it shifted balance away from the Maronite Christian presidency, which had been the main source of power from the founding of Lebanon, to a more equitable arrangement dividing power between Christians, Sunnis, and Shiites. Okay, the Taif agreement rewrote the parliamentary formula. It redefined Lebanon's relationship with Syria. It was a constitutional overhaul of how Lebanon governs itself. And it was brokered by Saudi Arabia and backed by the Arab League. And here's the part that makes this comparison truly insane, idiotic. Israel was not a party to the Taif agreement. They had nothing to do with it. It didn't involve Israel. Okay, there was a Lebanese civil war, and then they restructured the government of Lebanon, and that's the Taif agreement, and it was brokered by the Arab powers. Israel wasn't in the room. It was an entirely internal negotiation between Lebanese factions and how to share power in their own state. It had nothing to do with the Israel-Lebanon military relationship, because that wasn't what the Lebanese civil war was about. In fact, it was so far from a ceasefire now between Israel and Hezbollah that the Taif agreement, the one way that Israel actually came up in the Taif agreement is that in the restructuring of the Lebanese government in the Taif agreement, one of the one of the clauses in the agreement was that the only armed group in Lebanon would be the Lebanese army, because there was during the Lebanese Civil War, there's like the PLO and the Syrians came in, and there's all these different, and in the last 10 years, in the last 8 years of the Lebanese Civil War, there was now this new group called Hezbollah. Okay, so there was all these different. The Lebanese Civil War was not one war; it was a lot of different skirmishes and a lot of different wars that dragged in other powers over the course of a 15-year period. Okay, far beyond the scope of this conversation. But one of the clauses in the Taif agreement was that all armed groups have to lay down their weapons. There can only be the Lebanese army, except Hezbollah. Hezbollah is an exception because they're fighting Israel. And therefore, they can stay armed to continue fighting Israel. Literally, that's in the Taif agreement. So when he said, it's insane. Now, him saying that the Taif agreement is just like the ceasefire deal we have now, I mean, it's idiotic. Look, in November 2024, Israel and Hezbollah entered into a ceasefire, a cessation of hostilities, which is the precursor to this ceasefire. You can say that those two are very similar. That agreement and that ceasefire exists because of the military confrontation between Israel and Hezbollah. Israel's a central party to that conflict, Israel versus Hezbollah. The entire geographical framework of that ceasefire, both in November 2024 and now, has to do with the Litani River, the withdrawal arrangements, or the demand for withdrawal, Israel giving conditions under which they might withdraw in the future, the monitoring mechanisms. That's all organized around the Israel-Hezbollah conflict. Okay, and that was brokered by the United States, not by Saudi Arabia or the Arab League. And there's no power-sharing dimension of having to do with different Lebanese factions. There's no constitutional reform in the current ceasefire agreement. There's no restructuring of the Lebanese government. When Tom Barrack says that these two agreements, that the Taif agreement and the current ceasefire are basically the same thing, he's comparing an internal Lebanese constitutional settlement with no Israeli involvement whatsoever to an Israel-Hezbollah military disengagement that has no political dimension. The only thing they genuinely share is that they both involve Lebanon and they both involve Hezbollah, sort of. That's roughly as meaningful as saying that two completely different contracts are exactly the same because they were signed in the same city, or that one of the people was the same in signing both of them. He doesn't just have the date wrong. He doesn't understand what the Taif agreement was, what the purpose of the agreement was. Okay, but something no one in the room knows either, because people don't know anything. And they're all, they sit on these stages and they say these diplomatic sounding things. They mentioned the Taif agreement in 1949 and 1979, and they throw out dates and words, and it makes it seem very, very diplomatic and sophisticated. He doesn't know what he's talking about. He also framed the 1949 armistice right at the beginning there as a failed Lebanese political settlement. Because remember, this conversation is about Lebanon, Israel, okay? So he starts off by saying, well, they had an armistice in 1949 and that didn't work. What are you talking about? The 1949 armistice was between Israel and its Arab neighbors, Egypt, Jordan, Syria, and Lebanon, okay? And it was at the end of the first Arab-Israeli war. It was a regional ceasefire, not a Lebanese governance agreement. And it didn't fall apart. Israel was not at war with Lebanon after that. Officially, Lebanon doesn't recognize Israel's right to exist, so officially we're in a state of war. But Lebanon, after 1949, Israel did not have any more wars with Lebanon. 1967, Six-Day War, 1973, Yom Kippur War, Lebanon wasn't part of those wars. What on earth what does he mean that the 1949 armistice didn't work? But he also frames it as a Lebanon-Israel agreement, which it was not. Like treating it as the starting point of Lebanon's internal political failures, tying it to what happens in the Taif agreement, which results from the Lebanese Civil War, which starts in the 1970s because the PLO, which had been kicked out of Jordan, comes into Lebanon and starts destroying the country and causing internal strife. These things have nothing to do with each other. Okay. Then in this clip, you saw that he mentioned that the Shiites have 27 seats in the parliament. Ooh, good little fact to make yourself sound like you know what you're talking about. And his implication is that Hezbollah has 27 seats in the parliament, that's Hezbollah's political footprint, right? Because he's talking about the Shiites. He said, Hezbollah is not just we call them a terrorist group, but they're a political party. The Shiites have 27 seats in the parliament. Here's the problem. Those 27 seats aren't Hezbollah seats. They are Shia seats, and they're divided between two political parties. There are two Shiite political parties, Hezbollah and Amal. And Amal actually voted with the rest of the government to make Hezbollah's an armed Hezbollah illegal, meaning Hezbollah's military activity is illegal according to the Lebanese government, and Amal voted for that as well. Okay? So Hezbollah and Amal are distinct political organizations with their own rivalries and separate political identities, conflating all Shiite parliamentary representation with Hezbollah. In this context, because what's the case he's trying to make? He's trying to say that, you can't really disarm. It's not so simple to disarm Hezbollah. They're a legitimate political organization. Look, they have 27 seats in the parliament, which they don't. And he's trying to inflate Hezbollah's democratic legitimacy by saying, look, you have all these Shiites. A lot of the Shiites are anti-Hezbollah. It's just not accurate. Now, onto the issue of disarmament, where he's saying you can't disarm Hezbollah. He argues that it's essentially impossible. And his reasoning, let's remember what he said there, is demographic, right? He says you have the Shiites plus Palestinian refugees plus Syrian refugees. That probably constitutes a majority of Lebanon's population. And the Lebanese Sunni-dominated army isn't going to go fight their cousins. Now, excuse me, have you paid any attention to the Middle East over the last, 1,400 years? Sunnis and Shiites massacre each other all the time. Okay, that's just a ridiculous thing to say. But but his point about how, you have this whole constituency of the Syrian refugees and the Palestinian refugees and what is that? What does that have to do with disarming Hezbollah? He makes it sound compelling on the surface, but it confuses demographic size with armed political will. The Lebanese armed forces has a mandate to deploy south of the Litani River. That isn't a sectarian military issue. It's a question of state sovereignty. And here's what he doesn't mention. Since the November 2024 ceasefire, the Lebanese army has actually begun deploying south of the Litani River a little bit. It's not nothing, but it's not much. Basically, the picture is far more complicated than he's presenting it, and he's doing it for a very insidious reason. He's trying to make Hezbollah seem more legitimate and more powerful than they actually are. And he also says, and I really want to push back on this point, that you cannot get rid of a militia by killing them. He literally said that. He presents this as settled wisdom. But Hezbollah just suffered the worst military losses in its entire history over this last couple of years. Nasrallah is dead. Most of their senior command is dead. The organization's military infrastructure in South Lebanon has been severely degraded. And the question of whether sustained military pressure can fundamentally weaken an ideologically driven militia like this is genuinely an open and important question. But he waves it away as if the answer is obvious, right? You can't get rid of them by killing them. Now I want to address something else he said, because it bothered me more than any of the factual errors, of which there were, as I said, many. And this is only 3 minutes of this 28 minutes or whatever it is, half an hour talk. I mean, it was ridiculous. He said that the Lebanese army isn't going to disarm Hezbollah. And then he said, especially at a time when Israel is bombarding them, as if Israel's military campaign emerged from nowhere, right? Because he talked about how, that they have to defend themselves. It only strengthens their argument that they have to defend themselves against Israel. Everyone in Lebanon knows that the only reason Lebanon's getting bombed is because Hezbollah keeps attacking Israel. The Lebanese people are furious at Hezbollah. Okay, but he makes it seem like, well, Israel's bombarding them, as if Israel's military campaign emerged from nowhere. He didn't say a bad word about Hezbollah in this whole talk, right? As if Israel simply decided one day to start bombing its northern neighbor. So let's be clear. Let's review the sequence of events. Okay, on October 7th, 2023, if you haven't heard, Hamas launched the deadliest attack on the Jewish people since the Holocaust. Within days, Hezbollah began launching rockets, drones, and anti-tank missiles into northern Israel, completely unprovoked, unbidden by any Israeli action. Okay, this was a deliberate decision by Hezbollah's leadership to open a second front in the war against Israel while Israel was responding in the Gaza Strip. Now, for nearly a year, approximately 60,000 Israeli civilians were displaced from their homes in northern Israel, unable to return because of continuous Hezbollah bombardment. Oh, yes, let's add that in. Hezbollah only attacks Israeli civilians. They try to hit Israeli civilians. Their deliberate goal is to kill Israeli civilians. Israel does not deliberately kill any civilians. Okay, so you have Hezbollah. He doesn't say a bad word about them. It's insane. Now, the fact that Hezbollah bombards Israeli civilians with rockets unprovoked by Israel just doesn't get mentioned here, right? And then there's what's happening right now. When the United States and Israel launched strikes against Iran's nuclear program on February 28th, meaning when they launched this war, I don't mean on the nuclear program, when they launched the war on February 28th, Hezbollah didn't stay on the sidelines. They escalated their attacks and they started launching rockets and missiles and drones from southern Lebanon, right? Triggering air raid sirens across northern Israel, central Israel. Hezbollah. So they since March 2nd, I think it took them 3 days to join the war, right? They've been firing rockets at Israel. And there was one evening where they sent 100 rockets in a single evening. And despite the broader ceasefire between Israel and Iran that just started, Hezbollah has continued attacking until we came to the ceasefire in Lebanon. Okay. So when Tom Barrack frames Israeli military action in Lebanon as something that gives efficacy to the reason, it gives legitimacy to the reason that Hezbollah should exist to protect itself from Israel. I mean, first of all, you're talking about a terrorist organization, a 12 or Shiite fanatical terrorist organization that chants death to America and death to Israel. And, they have to defend themselves against Israel without mentioning anything about why Israel is doing this, right? He allows for people to see the causality of this backwards. Israel didn't attack Lebanon and force Hezbollah to defend itself. Hezbollah attacked Israel repeatedly across multiple conflicts and is still attacking Israel. And so he's framing the aggressor as the victim. And just because the aggressor is weaker than the victim doesn't change it. It's a distortion. And we need to call it out every time it appears. Look. Then he pivots to the Abraham Accords as the ultimate solution. This is towards the end of that clip. The Abraham Accords were a normalization agreement or a series of agreements between Israel and the UAE, Israel and Bahrain, and Morocco, and Sudan, okay? None of these states have anything to do with the dynamic that exists with the Lebanon, Hezbollah, Israel issue. Okay, that dynamic has to do with Iran, and it's a completely different, it's contextually irrelevant. Presenting the Abraham Accords as the answer to Hezbollah, the Hezbollah-Lebanon problem is a complete non sequitur. The Abraham Accords were a great diplomatic achievement, and you cannot apply them to a problem that they have nothing to do with. So when he calls, and then he calls Turkey the only real economy in the region. I'm not sure what metrics he's using and what he means by region. That claim ignores Israel as a much stronger economy than Turkey's. Saudi Arabia, the UAE, they all have substantial, more stable economies than Turkey. And Turkey has a very serious inflation problem. Its currency is collapsing. But of course, he was giving the speech in Turkey, so he has to say that. So there are real factual and analytical problems throughout that clip. But I want to end on something much bigger. Because underneath all of it, and this is like that stuff at the end about prosperity, underneath is what I want to talk about. Because underneath all of that is an assumption that I think is the most consequential error that Western policymakers have made in the Middle East since World War II. At the end of the clip, Barrack says that the answer has to be prosperity. That economic alignment of interests will ultimately cause people to give up their ideological commitments. right? That if we improve material conditions enough, the guns will be put down. And I want to ask a simple question. Has that worked? Right? The West poured billions of dollars into the Palestinian Authority. The West poured billions of dollars to rebuild Iraq, funded Lebanon's government for decades. And in each case, the underlying assumption was the same, that underneath the ideology, underneath the jihadist theology, underneath the willingness to die so that Westerners and Jews will die, right? Underneath all of that, there's a rational economic actor who, given the right conditions, will choose comfort over their ideology, over their murderous convictions. Okay. Now that assumption is wrong. I've talked about it many, many times. I've written about it many times, and that is it's like the key kernel of all the errors that the West makes in dealing with the Middle East. Okay. Hezbollah is not a poverty relief organization that picked up guns because nobody gave them jobs. Okay, this is a mistake. Westerners believe that poverty leads to terrorism. You hear it all the time. There's no evidence for that whatsoever. None, zero. There's no correlation. I want to make that clear. There's no correlation. Hezbollah believes that it is engaged in a divinely sanctioned war. They are 12er Shiites. They believe in bringing an apocalypse to the world and slaughtering all those who are infidels. That's what they believe in. They say it. Okay, its leadership has said this explicitly, repeatedly. Iran, which funds and directs it, is not a desperate nation lashing out from poverty. Okay, they could have been a very wealthy economy if they chose to spend their billions, hundreds of billions of dollars from oil sales on their country. It's a government that has deliberately subordinated its own population's economic well-being to an ideological project of death and destruction abroad for over 40 years. And that's Hezbollah. Hezbollah is Iran. The prosperity argument makes a very Western, very modern, very secular assumption that material self-interest is the primary driver of human behavior. Westerners believe that. They believe it so deeply that when these fanatical, murderous jihadists say that they want to destroy the infidel, they go, yeah. But really, if we gave them color TVs and air conditioning and a better job, they would drop the ideology. There's no evidence of that. For these jihadist movements, religious ideology is not negotiable. It's not a preference that they're going to trade away for GDP growth. Okay, it's their identity. It's their duty. It's their path to paradise. You can't outbid that with a trade deal. And this mistake has a history. After World War II, which was really the last time that the West was committed to destroying evil, when FDR made it the policy during World War II that they would only accept unconditional surrender from Nazi Germany and from Imperial Japan because they were evil ideologies. You had to bring them to their knees. But ever since then, the West has developed what I would call a diplomacy of accommodation, the belief that every conflict really has an economic root, and that every enemy has a price, and that the goal of foreign policy is to find that price and work with it. Okay, and that's the framework that made sense for rebuilding Europe, but it makes no sense when your adversary's explicit goal is not prosperity, but dominance. Not development, but the destruction of Western civilization. What the West lost after 1945 is the moral clarity to name evil and commit to defeating it, not containing it, not managing it, not enriching our way past it. Okay, you have to defeat it. And that clarity, which existed when we confronted those evil powers in World War II, that clarity and conviction has been replaced by ideological timidity, right? We mistake accommodation for sophistication. It sounds sophisticated. Well, let's have diplomacy, let's have conversations, and let's work together to find solutions. That it all sounds very sophisticated, but it's accommodation with evil. So when Tom Barrack says that prosperity is the answer, I wouldn't even say he's being naive. I would say that he's reflecting an assumption so deeply embedded in Western foreign policy thinking that most people don't even realize that it's just an assumption that's wrong. But it's a very deep-seated assumption, and it has real consequences. Look, in Gaza is like, you all know how destroyed Gaza is and what a miserable life the people have there. And yet, when polling has been done from October 7th through till this past November, after the 20-point plan was announced and the ceasefire was announced, these people have been moved around camp to camp. They've been bombed mercilessly, right? Think of the people in Gaza. And yet, when they were polled, one of the questions in the poll, and this is Palestinian polling, okay, from the PCPSR, which is a legitimate Palestinian polling agency. And one of the questions they asked them was, are you in favor of Hamas laying down its weapons if it will mean the end to the war with Israel? Are you in favor of Hamas laying down their weapons to end the war? And over 65%, over 2/3 of the people in Gaza said, no, they don't want Hamas to lay down their weapons if it will mean the end to the war. Think about that. Wouldn't you think they would want the end to the war? That's what I'm talking about. Until we're willing to take seriously the possibility that our adversaries are motivated by something that money cannot touch. Prosperity is not the answer, right? Their goals are not just different from ours, but they're incompatible with peaceful coexistence. We are going to keep repeating the same failures we've been making for 70 years. The Taif agreement didn't fail because Lebanon wasn't prosperous enough, right? It failed because Lebanon is dysfunctional, and because one party to that agreement, Hezbollah in Lebanon, is a terrorist organization and continued to bring death and destruction on Lebanon by attacking Israel. Not because they were poor, but because they have jihadist goals. Prosperity is not nothing, but it's not a substitute for moral clarity. And right now, the Middle East needs less economic theory and more honest judgment about what we are actually dealing with. If not, we are going to be doomed. And this is the disconnect that the Israelis have with everyone else right now. The Israelis are trying to actually defeat enemies, and we just keep getting stopped before we can finish the job. And it's the only way that the world has a chance to move past these evil entities that really just need to face defeat. There's like a lack of willingness to actually move to defeat. That's the real problem we're facing in the West these days. All right, I've said enough on this. Thanks for watching. God bless.